I think there's something very shaming about shame, or we can find ourselves shaming shame when actually it's a very normal human response to life events and to early attachments, and something that stays with us through the our lifespan. So this is fantastic for me. So I am going to just hopefully share my slides, and this is where my shape comes up because often it doesn't work very well first time. Let's just see how that goes. Oh, brilliant. We're in. So yeah, so the title of my presentation today is Changing Our Relationship with Shame by introducing shame containment theory. As I was very lovely introduced by Minu, I am a psychosexual therapist in the UK in private practice, and also a PhD researcher. I have to admit that I'm not a doctor yet, so you very kindly have called me Dr. Etherson, but I'm not quite Dr. Etherson yet. Hopefully I will be by the beginning of next year, but my thesis hasn't been submitted. It's just about to go in at the end of this year. So
That's totally
thank
no
you.
problem.
Yeah, optimism is good. So our aim for today is just to give a brief overview of shame containment theory, but redefining how we think about shame by thinking about shame through the lens of shame containment theory, really, and unshaming the shame, which is just the most amazing content for a shame conference, I think. So I'd just like to start by thinking a little bit about what shame containment theory is and how it was developed. How did I get to this point, really? And it was developed through personal and clinical experience, plus my PhD research kind of solidified things. But what I mean by personal experience is about 11 years ago, I had an experience of what I now call uncontained shame, which is that real horrible acute feeling of shame because I received a letter this day when I came in from work to say that I was being investigated for fraud, which came as a huge shock, and I moved into that experience of uncontained shame. Um, and that moment changed my life because what I realized was I'd had this experience or this feeling of this type of shame so many times developed from childhood, and that my whole life had been or I set up my life to make sure that I didn't actually feel this feeling. And that's what I now call shame containment strategies. And being able to recognize shame from that perspective has been the thing that's really helped me to think about what shame is, how shame feels, why we have shame in particular ways. And thankfully, I did receive another letter after the investigation to say it had just been a mistake and everything was fine. But the point for me was is that it really helped me to tap into this experience of shame and become very, very interested in shame. From the clinical experience, I started to recognize in my own clients when I was sat in front of them in the therapy room that they were describing very, very similar things. So I realized there was something here. And when I went to the literature, I recognized that there was a huge gap. And that was the thing that prompted me to do a PhD. And then the PhD has solidified what I was already thinking from my own experience of shame and my clinical experience, just to be able to make it more robust with empirical research and, bringing that scientific element in. So shame containment theory considers shame through the attachment lens. So there's lots of different ways that we can consider shame and research shame. And I was very interested in why do we have shame? Where does it come from? Where does it start? And what I realized was really it starts with attachment. So it starts from very, very early childhood, possibly even in utero. Um, Shame containment theory also considers shame to be a process. So there's different interrelated elements. So there's 5 component parts to shame containment theory, which I'll discuss as we go further along. And so what that means is it brings a language to shame that we've not necessarily had before. So one of the things I realized in my research on my first year of my PhD, looking at the literature, is that people would talk about shame, but they would actually talk about um, different experiences of shame, but they would just use the word shame. And I got very, very confused by that because I realized my own experience that there was different experiences of this process of this emotion. So being able to compartmentalize that and name those different component parts has been one of the things that's key to shame containment theory. Um, so it helps us to understand the theory itself, helps us to understand shame, but also its purpose. So I believe that shame has a really, really important purpose, which I'll explain in a moment. It also offers a framework with which to work with shame. So not only does it give an understanding of shame, but we can also use it as a therapeutic model as well. It can be utilized by all disciplines of psychotherapy and counseling, so it doesn't really matter which model of psychotherapy that you use or counseling that you use. Shame containment theory can be applied um, to whatever modality, and it can also be used within social work, education, criminal justice system, and medical settings because what we're dealing with is humans. So wherever there is a human, you could also apply it to business. Wherever there is a human, there will be shame. So shame containment theory can be applied to all settings pretty much that we can think of. So as I said, I do believe that shame has a purpose. So from the perspective of shame containment theory, and everything I'll talk about from here on in is given from the perspective of shame containment theory. So some theorists think that there's no purpose to shame. Others see it as a vital component to being human, and that's the stance that I come from. So its purpose is to keep us attached to our caregivers, or originally from first humans within our tribe. So basically our group, and our group is often family. It's there to prevent us from being abandoned. So therefore, shame is absolutely vital to our survival. And I'll explain a little bit more about that process and why it's so important to us and why it's part of our attachment system. So therefore, and this is where we come into unshaming and changing the narratives around shame, we actually need shame. We all need shame. And shame is always about protection. And again, that statement will hopefully make a lot more sense as I go through the presentation this afternoon. So for this reason, this is why it's essential to understand and change our relationship with shame rather than trying to eradicate it. So a lot of the messages I see around shame, particularly on things like social media, or I have an app for meditations and different things like that. And if you, I have an option to type in the word shame, and all of these various meditations come up. And often, what those meditations are things like letting go of shame, healing shame. And from my perspective, they're the things that we're not supposed to be doing with shame. What we're supposed to be doing is understanding why we have shame. And we can get to the point of actually using our shame to help guide us, which again, hopefully will make a lot more sense by the end of this presentation. So I just want to now move into the components of shame. And these 5 components of shame are from this perspective of shame containment theory. So this is what actually makes up the theory. So first of all, we have attachment injuries. So they're the things that we experience in childhood from, say, being very, very young or being in utero, the disconnect that we have between ourselves and caregivers. As a response to that, we have contained shame. We also have shame containment strategies, uncontained shame, and recontainment strategies. But I'm going to talk about each of those individually, so they make sense. So I just want to start with attachment injuries, and these are events between humans causing a rupture in attachment. And I'm sure that if people are familiar with the idea of attachment theory, they'll understand very well what I'm talking about here. Um, Shame containment theory is actually an extension of attachment theory. So this is where a lot of the thinking has come from, and a lot of the previous work from other theorists, when I looked at creating shame containment theory, they also looked at shame through that attachment lens as well, which was ideal for me. So attachment injuries induce a perception of loss or abandonment. So if you think about from that very, very small child who's absolutely dependent on their caregivers, whoever that caregiver is, if there's a sense of rupture or a disconnect, that sense of abandonment is going to be pretty significant because they don't know necessarily whether they are going to be connected back up with. So that for me, shame is really about abandonment and loss, or the prevention of abandonment and loss. So happens initially from caregiver, again, whoever that caregiver is, to child, but can also happen in adult relationships. The term attachment injuries, I first came across this from the work by Sue Johnson, who was a relationship therapist. And she coined this term when she was working with adults in intimate relationships, so generally couples. And that in that couple dynamic, that if one of the partners was um, disconnected or wasn't available, that could create an attachment injury, for example. But for me, it really fit with this isn't just about adult relationships. This is about all of our relationships as being a human. The start with initially, so that's why I put initially from caregiver to child, but we can experience attachment injuries in friendships when we're adults, friendships when we're children, attachment injuries with teachers, for example. So it's anybody who has or anybody that we are in a relationship that is important, not necessarily that we feel connected to. It could be an attachment injury with a boss. We may not necessarily like that boss, but that attachment is important, for example. So we do have we have the potential of experiencing attachment injuries through the lifespan. So what might attachment injuries look like? So attachment injuries might be physical and sexual abuse, so the things that we would expect to create significant trauma, for example, severe neglect or emotional and psychological abuse. But the more innocuous injuries, and this is what's come up in my research, for example, are the things that we don't necessarily perhaps think of as a traumatic event or something that would create trauma. So things like unavailability of caregivers, but that could be physical or emotional. So a lot of my research participants talked about having quite cold or kind of shut off, or parents who were physically there but emotionally that they were not available to them. Uninterest in the child, because uninterest makes us feel like we are unworthy or unlovable, and that in itself is an attachment injury. Irritability and dismissiveness might be another one because we're thinking about how is that perceived through the child lens, not necessarily what the adult thinks. So the adult who is perhaps being who's irritated by the child knows that they still love that child, but the child can't discern that that's what's happening. It's really important when I mention this part when I talk about innocuous injuries, is that there is no such thing as a perfect parent. But the ideal would be that if a parent recognizes that they are being irritable or dismissive, that they create a repair. So shame tends to develop and stay with us when there is an attachment injury with no repair. So the repair is key. And this isn't an exhaustive list, there could be multiple different events that could create an attachment injury for a child. This is a real key part of shame containment theory, is thinking about shame and attachment, or shame and those attachment injuries. So I consider shame to be part of our attachment system, which is developed in infanthood. So what that basically means is we have an attachment system that helps us to remain bonded, and shame is a really, really important part of that attachment system. It's the thing that we actually need to help us to manage it. So it's first experience, and the reason why I put experience in quotes out, when we develop self-consciousness, is that might be the first time that the child, not necessarily the first time that child has had a shame or an event or an attachment injury where shame might be produced, but when we develop self-consciousness at around the age of 14 to 16 months old, that's when we will experience it as shame, that there's something not right with me, there's something wrong with me, I am bad. It's from around about that age. So shame, as part of that attachment system, acts as a fail-safe. This is how I perceive it. When we experience a rupture in connection with no repair, so shame will come in to help us manage that sense of disconnect. So what that basically means is shame is the response to an attachment injury. So we feel a sense of disconnect in whatever way that is. Shame will come up as part of our attachment system to as a response to help us, say, manage that attachment injury. And how it does that is it tells us to modify our behavior so that our caregivers will allow us to approach them to reconnect, or they will see us as attractive again so that they will approach us to reconnect. Um, all this is happening through the experience of the child who doesn't have any cognitive capacity to understand that this is what's happening. So it just happens in a very automatic way without necessarily even thinking about that there is no cognition to think about this is the thing that we're doing. Shame will just come up. So contained shame, which is the second element of the shame process, is the consequence of that protective response. So if you think about we have the attachment injury, we feel a sense of disconnect, that can produce a sense of abandonment and loss, which is very scary to the child. We may not survive as the child perceives it. So our shame will come up as a response to modify our behavior and tell us that we are bad. So it positions us in the position of bad child, good parent, because if the child can perceive themselves as bad and the adult is good, that's a more protective position for us to be in because we can rescue ourselves from that position by modifying our behavior and being good or whatever it is that we do. Either sometimes it can be if we are being told that we are too much, we will be less. Or if we're less than, we'll try and be more. So we'll always try and right our behavior. So contained shame is the consequence of this protective shame response. There's shame scripts that will tell us that we're not lovable, that we're unworthy, bad, defective, or not safe. So I didn't put this in the slides today because I don't think there was enough time for that. But I think there's two parts to contained shame. One is the internalized shame that I am unlovable, I am unworthy, I am bad. And then externalized shame, which is I am not safe. So I need to present myself in a good light to make sure that people don't see me as being unworthy or bad or not lovable or not valuable. So there's two different elements to contain shame. So contain shame is also trait shame. Some of you might have heard of that expression before, of that term before. So trait shame, it's who we think we are. It's our identity. It is our personality and our characteristic, which is very different from uncontained shame. It's that acute experience of shame, which I'll talk through in a moment. And shame makes us believe these scripts to keep us safe. So it has to put us in this position. If we don't have parents who are able to make repairs, it it puts us in this position. So as I said, that we can always rescue ourselves. We generally, as I'm sure you will all know in this conference, we generally don't have conversations about shame in the way that we should. We don't really have any conversations about shame at all, which is why this summit is so fantastic. And we haven't helped parents to understand that this might be something that is going on for their children, for their child, if they um, do something without actually making that repair. So if shame comes up as that protective response, and we as children don't understand why we have it, because why would we? We're children, it will feel like it's real to us. We need parents and we need caregivers, we need adults to help us to understand as children that shame is there to try and protect you, and this is what is happening. Obviously, you would do that in a way that a child would understand, so that that shame can dissipate. And because we don't have that, the shame then just becomes contained. These shame responses that are there to try and protect us with these shame scripts has nowhere to go. So it remains in a contained state. So this is why I call this part of the shame process, this chronic element of shame. I call it contained shame because it has to stay in position. So the reason why it has to stay contained, excuse me, so not felt, preferably not felt by us, but certainly not seen by others, is if our caregivers actually saw what we believe about ourselves as being bad, not good enough, if they saw that, then they're definitely going to abandon us. So it's much safer to keep this idea of who we are contained so that we don't show it to anybody as this fail safe. If there's therapists in the room, which I'm sure there will be, what you might see in the therapy room is contained shame, but it might be attributed to something else. Again, because we haven't had these conversations about shame, we haven't really been taught shame or about shame within our therapeutic practice. It's so easy to miss. And there's also something about having permission as professionals and practitioners to not know, because unless we've been taught, why would we know? Um, but what it can be attributed to are things like low self-esteem, depression, and anxiety. And often this is what clients will present in therapy with. My self-esteem is terrible, but what they might actually be talking about is, or expressing, is this sense of contained shame that they are not enough. So the uncontained shame, so if we have contained shame, there is all of the potential that this contained shame might become uncontained. And this is what uncontained shame is. So it's the unexpected exposure of this contained shame. And it can be exceptionally painful because it's also the feeling of the original attachment injuries as well. So not only is it our sense of not being okay, being presented to the world and us really feeling it, it's also about being in a state of emotional memory, body memory, where we are remembering the original attachment injuries of this sense of abandonment and potential of not surviving. So it's an exceptionally painful um, element of the shame process. So what uncontained shame would look or feel like is that this is the very acute experience of shame, and it's often what's called state shame. So we are in a state of shame as opposed to trait shame, which is about who we believe we are. So signs of uncontained shame, the physiological signs, so this is where shame becomes very, very somatic, is a kick to the gut. It can feel like nausea, vomiting. It can be feel like gastric involvement, loss of appetite, shock, panic, anxiety. So we can kind of go into a state of shutdown and or hypoarousal and hyperarousal, like very, very quickly. We can just rapidly shift from these states. When basically what we're talking about is being really dysregulated. Psychologically, what might happen when we're in a state of uncontained shame is we might obsessively think. What we're trying to do is we're trying to think our way out of this feeling. Often uncontained shame happens when, like in my experience, when um, something presents itself that we've not been prepared for, something comes along as a shock. So being found out, making a mistake, getting into trouble somehow is often the thing that activates uncontained shame. So we're trying to rescue ourselves from this experience by thinking, well, what if I did something different, or who can I blame instead? Which are very, very natural ways of trying to deal with and manage uncontained shame because it's so intolerable. We have to do something with it. So thinking about worst case scenarios. So worst case scenarios, how the protective factor there is, if we can think of every terrible thing that can happen, we can prevent ourselves from further uncontainment. We can prevent ourselves from further shock. So if we can be prepared, it's not going to come as a shock. We can often use things like or terms like mortification. I felt mortified, or the feeling of mortification, which is the feeling of death, as is annihilation, going to be destroyed, suicidal ideation, and unfortunately for some people, people can complete suicide. So uncontained shame is an exceptionally difficult experience of the shame process. So how we prevent ourselves from experiencing uncontained shame the best we can is by developing shame containment strategies. So the shame containment strategies are there to contain the shame felt from the attachment injury. So if you can see, this is what I mean by shame containment theory posits that this is the process. So we have the attachment injury, we have the shame that comes up as a protective response to tell us that we're not okay, we need to be better. That sense of shame needs to be contained. We can't afford anyone to say it, because if it becomes uncontained, it becomes intolerable. So shame containment strategies are there to manage this process thus far, to try and prevent us from becoming uncontained. However, shame containment strategies are also there to help us to maintain relationship bonds as well. So it also helps us to conform to family and culture and society. So the things that we do to make us look favorable so that we can remain attached to our, let's say, family, culture, society, friendships, whatever it is um, that we need to have a fulfilling life. Shame containment strategies will help us to do that. You could also call shame containment strategies our conscience. They're the things that make us do the right thing because we don't want to feel the shame of doing the wrong thing, if that makes sense. So therefore, shame containment strategies help us to survive as well. So they help us to remain emotionally intact. So shame containment strategies have a really, really vital role in being human and being social and helping us to manage being in a society. So we have life limiting shame containment strategies or life enhancing shame containment strategies. So the life enhancing shame containment strategies are the things I've just talked about there, the things that help us to remain bonded, to remain within our cultures, that our societies that we want to remain included in. Life limiting shame containment strategies are the things that perhaps worked when we were children, because shame containment strategies happen from, or we develop them from being a child. They may not necessarily look the same as they did when we were children. Obviously, we move into adulthood and we develop more sophisticated shame containment strategies. But some of them start to become life limiting. So an example of that might be the person who comes to therapy and says that they feel stuck. They want to make a change in their life, but they feel really, really stuck. The shame containment strategy of being risk averse, of not putting themselves out there so they're not seen. So then they're not vulnerable. So there's less risk of uncontained shame, for example. That's starting to get in the way of them doing the things that they want to do. So that's when shame containment strategies, just as an example, start to become life limiting. So what might shame containment strategies look like? And again, this isn't an exhaustive list. And um, I don't necessarily like putting lists together when I think about shame because it's very, very individual. Like the question, really good question in the previous session about are there gender differences when it comes to shame? I don't think we feel shame any differently at all, but how we manage shame might look different depending on our gender, our culture, religion, all sorts of different reasons. Our experiences, our childhood experiences will all determine how we manage shame. So this is one of the reasons why I don't necessarily like to put this together, because if we are working therapeutically with people, we really need to understand that person to understand what their shame containment strategies might be and why they have developed particular ones, because that might be really important to them. But things that you might see might be things like anger and aggression. So that's about keeping people away. So the less we are seen, it's very difficult to connect with people who are angry and aggressive. So that puts that person in a less vulnerable position of being seen and the potential of any uncontained shame. Lying, exaggerating. I haven't really got time to explain why we have these particular shame containment strategies, unfortunately, this morning. But I'm sure they can you can kind of make sense of why we have these particular ones. Drugs and alcohol, the reason why I put that in is because that's just about numbing any sense of contained shame, just numb any sense of shame at all, just trying to avoid shame. But the important one for me, and amongst all of this, which might seem like a strange one, is believing that you're bad. So the contained shame, the shame response that tells us that we are bad, that then becomes contained shame. We can't possibly allow people to see how bad we are. That can eventually become a shame containment strategy, because if we believe that we are bad, again, it stops us from being vulnerable, it stops us from getting into relationships, or it might stop us from taking the job that we really want to take. So it reduces any level of vulnerability where there is the potential of uncontained shame. So really just it keeps us shut down, kind of away from people. So the final element of shame containment theory are shame containment strategies. So this is an attempt to recontain the uncontained shame. So how I liken to think this is, if you imagine a Jack in the Box. I don't even know if we still have Jack in the Boxes anymore. It's a very old childhood toy. So you have a box with a lid on it, and inside is a puppet. And if you imagine that is the contained shame, it's in a box and the lid's on. And your shame containment strategies are the things that actually help you to keep that lid on, and everything is safe and you can go about your life. And you might be the only person who knows that that contained shame is inside. Something comes along that is unexpected. So if you think in the Jack in the Box, a button is pressed and suddenly the lid is lifted off very abruptly, and the Jack will pop out. So this is how I like an uncontained shame. So something comes along that presses our button, something that we're not expecting. So like say being found out, making a mistake, whatever it is, and that Jack being the lid off, the being seen is intolerable. We cannot manage in that state. So our recontainment strategies are the things that we develop to put the lid back on, to get the Jack back in its box. So I'm hoping that kind of makes sense, the distinction between what a shame containment strategy is and what a recontainment strategy is. So recontainment strategies is an attempt to manage the uncontained shame. But it could also, in childhood, it could also be the attempt to make reparation following an attachment injury as well. Recontainment strategies, I haven't given a list because they can look very, very similar to shame containment strategies as well. The difference between what is a shame containment strategy and what is a recontainment strategy is in its relationship to the uncontained shame. Is it trying to prevent the uncontained shame from popping out of the box, or is it trying to put the lid back on? So the strategies are they're very, very similar. It's the intention of which we are using those strategies. Unfortunately, recontainment strategies aren't always healthy for us or often for the people around us. So an example of that might be violence against self or others. So if we are in a state of disrespect, for example, if we are disrespected, we have no respect. If we have no respect, we are not valuable. That is a state of uncontained shame. And because that is intolerable to us, we need to do something to regain that respect. And often, so again, gender difference, for example, what the evidence seems to show at the moment is that men will adopt violence or attacking others in the sense of regaining that respect, so as a recontainment strategy, whereas perhaps females don't necessarily use violence in the same way. So another thing that we might do is to attempt to project the shame onto the other. So the uncontained shame is intolerable, I'm going to give it to somebody else. And that might be done through humiliation. I've just got a really quick infographic there. This has been adapted by Nathanson's Compass of Shame, if anyone's familiar with that. So in the middle there, I have shame containment strategies or recontainment strategies, because it's, again, they can be either, but just to put them into a category, what those strategies might look like might be about attacking self, telling ourselves that we are bad. That is the inner critic, for example. If we can tell ourselves that we are not okay, then there won't be any further shock when somebody else tells us that we're not okay. We kind of get in there first, so we will attack self. Attack others, I've just described there. Reparation, that's about trying to make the repair so that we can feel like we are reconnected with the person that we perhaps have had an attachment injury with. That will always put us in a safer position. Splitting off, that would be perhaps avoiding any sense of shame. So we'll just split off that emotion, or we might split off anger, because certainly in my experience when I was growing up, if I was to display any anger as a child, I would be there would be a huge sense of shame for that. That would not be acceptable within my family. So I split off anger. We can split off all sorts of different things. We can split off our sexuality in order to avoid the sense of uncontained shame. Disappearing, so that would just be that sense of withdrawal. So we might disappear by again substances or various different methods that we have for that, or avoiding situations, which is slightly different from disappearing. So disappearing is withdrawal, avoiding is about being risk averse, about not putting ourselves in a position of where we might potentially be seen. So we're much safer. So that's shame containment strategy. Shame containment theory. That's a real whistle-stop overview of the theory. But just to kind of finish off, why do we need recontainment strategies? So without good recontainment strategies, we have no way of managing uncontained shame, which is intolerable. And no conscious strategies can lead to either shutdown, so the withdrawal, or suicidal ideation, because it can be the only way that we can feasibly manage this intolerable acute feeling of uncontained shame. So just thinking about maybe applying some of the concepts of shame containment theory, one of the big things for me is permission. And I think the end game when it comes to managing, being with, changing our relationship with shame is compassion. But in my experience of working with people, which I've done for well over a decade when I've been thinking about shame, I've realized that this has been very, very, very difficult for people. So what I tend to do is I tend to put in permission before we get to compassion. And I found that that's been very beneficial for my clients. So when we think about compassion, it's often suggested that compassion is an antidote to shame. And I kind of struggle with that phrase slightly because antidote is poison. And that can imply that shame is bad. And from a perspective of shame containment theory, I believe it feels bad, feel terrible, intolerable, one of our worst experiences as a human, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is bad. Compassion can also be difficult for clients to access, especially if a shame containment strategy is that they are bad, because that puts them in a safer position to try and help them to understand that they're not bad and actually they're really kind and they're lovable. That can be too much, it can be a step too far. What we don't want to do is take away shame containment strategies that are working too quickly, because that can put them into a state of uncontained shame. So it might be that if you've ever found yourself working with people and you're thinking about compassion, which we all do when we think about shame, and there's some resistance there, it's because they can't get to that point. It's too exposing to think of themselves in a compassionate way. So when they can't do that, it can also make them feel like they fail. So that just compounds the shame of not being good enough already. So the reason why I think about permission first is it allows the shame to be there until it's not needed. And um, it acknowledges shame's adaptive role. So what I do now is when I'm thinking about working with shame with my clients, and I use shame containment theory a lot within my work, is I use a lot of psychoeducation to explain why we have shame. So shame is there to try and protect us from these attachment injuries. It will tell us that we're not okay, even though that's not actually true, so that we can modify our behavior, because that's about the only thing that we have as children is ourselves. How do we manage this situation? So I explain, as I said, the shame's adaptive role and why we have it. So that in itself gives permission, like, oh, okay, yeah, I now understand why I have this shame. Um, and like I said before, it allows shame to feel painful, but not bad, which flips the relationship with shame. So clients can much more easily apply the idea of permission, which can then lead them to compassion. So for me, I just feel like permission is a really important step before we get to the idea of compassion. So reframing our relationship with shame, which is that this is my big ambition. So if we start to think about shame is developed initially to prevent abandonment and death, again, that gives the permission for shame to actually be there. And contained shame is the product of that protective shame response. It isn't who we are. It's what we've developed as a strategy. But contained shame, even the sense of not being okay, can also be protective because it can keep us hidden. For some children, trying to hide and not be seen might be the safest thing for them. If they're in potentially physically abusive environment, for example. Uncontained shame is also protective because it becomes our alarm system, or actually it is our alarm system once we understand what uncontained shame is about, is because it tells us that we have perhaps gone against our own morals or values, our own standards, or it may be that we've gone against a culture's morals and values. But those moral and values may not necessarily be ours. So part of the therapeutic work when it comes to uncontained shame is to look at, and I know there's there's a talk today about shame and queer people, which I think is absolutely brilliant and really, really key. So if you think about from that perspective, somebody might feel shame because they've gone against their family's ideals, for example. But that uncontained shame is trying to protect them by saying it's not okay for us to be different. We have to be the same. But what we need to do is we need to figure out whether that's actually true or not, whether that's accurate. And for us as individuals, that won't be accurate at all. We are perfectly fine in our queerness, for example, if that makes sense. Our shame containment strategies are there to prevent the painful, um, acute sense of uncontained shame. But our shame containment strategies are also needed in everyday life. They are the things that actually help us to think our way through situations. Is this a good thing for me to do? Or will I feel not okay if I do this thing? Or will I be banished if I do this thing? So it just helps us to be in society. So for an example, a life-enhancing shame containment strategy might be politeness. Life is just so much better when we can be polite to people because then we're going to be liked and we're not going to feel that sense of shame. Our life limiting shame containment strategies were once useful. So it's about honoring the ones that we have had that have protected us in the past, but perhaps they are the things that we don't need anymore. Recontainment strategies are needed to help us with the uncontained shame. But part of the therapeutic work is to develop some life enhancing recontainment strategies because we always need them as well. We can't be left in a state of uncontained shame because it's too intolerable, it's too much for us. So a new understanding of shame for me, and this has all come from my own research. I didn't think these things when I first started my PhD, but my PhD has really helped me to rethink and to change my understanding and change my own relationship with shame as well. So all of the things that I've talked about here, I have applied to myself and my own journey. So shame isn't to be healed. We heal the attachment injuries, and this is the work that we do as therapists. Shame is there to keep us bonded to self and others as well. We don't want to self-rupture. We don't want to split off and try and disavow parts of ourselves because that is exceptionally painful. So being in touch with our shame can help us guide our way through life as well. So this is a really key thing for me, that we can start to use our shame to navigate our way through life by shame anxiety is the anxiety of the shame that we might feel if we do a particular thing. So if we're feeling anxious about something, it might be that we shouldn't be doing that thing because it goes against our values and our own standards. So we have to listen to shame and try and listen to what it's trying to tell us, but also to discern whether that information is correct, because shame doesn't always have the story right. If you think about shame developed in childhood, it absolutely did not have the story right at all, that we were bad, not good enough, too much, whatever. But those were the messages that it was given to us to keep us as safe as possible. So we have to start disentangling those scripts because they're not accurate. So just from a perspective of shame containment theory, so shame is part of our attachment system, just to sum up, serving to protect us from abandonment and emotional death. So again, from the perspective of shame containment theory, it's a guide, but we need to discern whether the shame has the story right or not. And that's something that can be explored in therapy. We need to recognize that shame is not who we are, but that protective response formed from those early attachment injuries to try and manage our often family environment. And permission to experience shame fully without judgment. You know, as I say, shame is painful, but it's not bad. It is trying to help us, but it doesn't always do it in the best way. And how can we develop healthy shame containment strategies and recontainment strategies to help us to manage the shame constructively instead? So the final thought, changing our relationship with shame involves permission and then compassion, enabling people to shift from shaming themselves and understanding the protective nature of shame, which is again my ambition. So thank you for your time, and I'll just put up my contact details there, but I'm presuming that when you get the recording, they will all be there anyway. So I'm just going to stop sharing there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk and your research. It is amazing, and it's going to be very helpful for anybody who, was going to work with this. I had one question from my end. In my work with a client who constantly criticizes herself before others can, it's almost as if preemptively she's just doing that before others, come and tell her that, this is how it is. So,
Yeah.
how might shame containment theory guide the process of helping her move on from self-attack towards self-compassion?
So the first thing to do is absolutely have that permission that it's a strategy to try and keep her safe. So it's not necessarily that she is bad or even that she believes, well, she might believe that, but the strategy makes her believe that she's not okay as part of that protection. So the first thing I would do is help her through psychoeducation to understand why that thing is happening. Because once you can do that, that's when you can start to change that relationship because it's a really important thing for her to do, isn't it? To try and keep herself as safe as possible because she's trying to prevent any of those surprise attacks. So she's already on the floor, she can't get any lower. It's not going to come as a surprise to her. Um, so one of the things that I do with the inner critic, for example, is that I try and help people to move when you understand the process and why it's there, it can start to become the inner protector instead. So we can literally rename the inner critic to the inner protector because once you do that and that inner critic comes in, clients can start to think, oh, okay, I understand why you're here now, you're trying to protect me. And it's very similar if anyone has done internal family systems, it's very, very similar process to that where we can start to honor that part and understand, let's say, why it's there. So I don't actually have an inner critic anymore. I have an inner protector. And just reframing that has changed it completely. So also the voice has changed. It's not harsh anymore. It's like, are you sure we want to be doing this? Is this okay? And that real curious and being able to check out. So and it's about not it's not taking that strategy away too quickly because if that all she has at that particular point in time, she needs it until you can help her to understand why it's there and perhaps maybe put other things in place. So this would be also the work around contain shame in therapies to be able to express these things safely. So you are that safe, you then become that safe container for that. It can be expressed to you as a therapist and to start to change those scripts. So once she understands why the script was there in the first place, she can start to change it because that script isn't accurate. So that's the work to be done.
And I think that gives so much control back to
Yeah,
that person, right? So
absolutely it is.
maybe that
Yeah.
that's was something that was missing from a long time.
Yeah, I think agency is really, really important when we do work on shame because often we feel like we don't have any agency. So once we recognize that, oh, I've been doing this thing, even though I've been doing it unconsciously, it's still been a deliberate act. So being able to even consciously choose a shame containment strategy, for example, that's going to keep us safer is agency.
Mhm.
So suddenly where that shifts that relationship with shame, we can use it instead.
That makes so much sense. We have a query from Meg. It's a detailed one. Should I read it out, or would you like to go refer to that and then answer?
Would you be able to read it out?
Yes,
I can't
yes.
actually see it.
Yes. So she first of all said that it's a phenomenal research, and she's been working on an intervention of narrative therapy for BPD and using the shame containment theory as one of the frameworks. So she has a couple of questions. There are four questions. Would you like me to go one by one or just place it all together to you?
Um, if you do it all together, because they might be interrelated.
Yeah. So the first is the link between uncontained shame and active abuse or trauma. How do we pivot from uncontainment to containment when trauma is chronic or repetitive? The second one, the link between shame containment and stigma or diagnostic labels such as BPD, which is recently being understood as a complex trauma response more than a disorder. If lack of community deepens shame, or if there's a failure of implementing a containment strategy, would it help to pivot to acknowledge the act of wanting to meet an unmet need instead? And if there are any further reading or, outside of attachment theories that you would want to get from.
Okay, I'll try to remember all of that. So, I think one of the questions, I think the third question about, I think it was about giving permission to want to connect with. with groups, that I think absolutely permission is, for me, permission is absolutely key. The work that would be done in therapy is, of course, you might have that desire, but is it safe? And you know, you would figure out what would need to happen with that, but absolutely give permission for that desire at least to do that. There isn't anything, so there's my paper. There is a very small ebook, but until I finish my thesis, which will hopefully be in December, that's when I can start to put more things out. So the information on shame containment theory is quite limited at the moment, unfortunately, because I just haven't had time to do it. I'm still sort of like in the thick of doing it, really. So there will be some stuff coming in the new year. The thing with PBD, I didn't realize, for me, it's always made sense that it was a trauma response as opposed to a condition. And I think you're right. I think there's that in itself can be so stigmatizing. So then we already feel shame from the attachment injuries. So if you think about overt attachment injuries, which is, you know, things like sexual abuse, for example, shame will come up as a response, as a protective response, to say this was because of me, because then that puts that person in the position of control. So then to further stigmatize that and further impound the shame because you have a disordered personality, for me is horrendous. Sorry, Mini, can you just read out the question specifically to PBD? Oh, you're on mute.
Minu, I think you're on mute. I'll just do that.
All right.
Thank you.
So the question asks the link between shame and shame containment and stigma or diagnostic labels such as BPD, which is recently being understood as a complex trauma response more than a disorder. So I believe they want to understand a bit more about how the two could be related.
Yeah, I think hopefully I've just explained that. I've just remembered what the other question was about uncontained shame. I think uncontained shame presents itself when it comes to trauma, when we still take responsibility for what happened to us, as opposed to being able to put the shame on the perpetrator. So that would be the work. The more we can express our contained shame and change those scripts, the less contained shame we have, the less potential for being uncontained. But we also need to remember that we actually need the ability to be uncontained, because that tells us that we're not safe as well. And this is where shame and shame containment theory actually becomes relatively complex, because we need it. So perhaps the thing to do is look at what those recontainment strategies are as well. So it's a whole process. It's looking at the whole shame process. So healing from the attachment injuries, understanding that it wasn't our fault, shifting that level of contained shame, changing those scripts will reduce the amount of contained shame we have, so that we're less likely to become uncontained. But then bringing some things in, or even having some really good shame containment strategies to prevent uncontained shame, for example. So it just becomes a whole process of work, if that makes sense. It's quite difficult to get into it in the short time that we
I
have,
think that made a lot
unfortunately.
of sense. I think that was a really great answer. And we have during our summer, we have a lot of people joining in who are not from psychology background, like who are maybe doing other, from other fields. So for someone who is not from the field, what can they take back from this talk, or maybe change their relationship with shame?
Um, so I certainly don't think that you need to be a therapist to apply shame containment theory, because I think it's humans that need to apply shame containment theory. So one of the things that I've discovered when I've presented this to therapists and non-therapists as well, so people who work with people, basically, is that people can relate it to themselves. This isn't necessarily about trauma. Not everyone has had traumatic experiences, but I think everyone has had shame because we're supposed to. So it really seems to resonate with people on an individual basis, so that they can then use that in their own relationships with their own family or relationships or colleagues, work colleagues, wherever they are. It's basically it's about human relating, is what shame containment theory presents. Is this is what we do as humans. So it doesn't really matter whether you're a therapist. Obviously, I've mentioned things about being in therapy in this session about people who are thinking about working with people. Might be how you do it, but this can apply to any human.
All right. Thank you for answering all the questions.
I actually have one question, Meenu. I know we're a bit short on
Yeah.
time, but
So
just
no.
one question I was wondering if I could ask you. I was particularly wondering in terms of how it looks in a therapeutic space when a client starts working on that relationship with shame, and how you mentioned that you don't have an inner critic anymore, you have an inner protector. What are some ways, or what are some things that we can see in a session with a client that could tell us that they're making that move towards a contained relationship? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So one of the things that I've done within my own therapeutic work is I use a lot of psychoeducation, which gives people an understanding of what it is that's going on. And when you do that, even in one session, you actually watch people drop into themselves. It's almost like their body just relaxes because suddenly they make sense of, I've done this stuff my whole life and I've never understood why, which is really quite incredible. So it's also about them then being able to use the language. So once they start using the language back to me, they can understand what it is that's happened. So, just a very, very quick example, it might be that somebody comes in and said, oh, I've had a bit of a difficult week because this thing happened and I became really uncontained. But then they might say, I did become really uncontained, but that uncontained shame didn't last for very long because I used this shame containment strategy. So this is kind of how it's starting to work in my own work. So being able to have that language so that people suddenly understand what it is that's happening has been key. So they might be some of the things that you see. It might also just be that they say, you know what, I just feel better. It might just be as simple as that they don't necessarily feel like they have this racing brain that is telling them that they're not okay. There's just, more of a quietness.
So I think there's so much validation that this, mode of therapy or the structure that can provide to, whoever is going through the therapy, going through it as well, right? So, and because you are basically looking at their life, you're starting with the attachment break, the issue that happened. You are then going through what are the containment strategies went through, and then, uncontainment that went through,
Yeah.
and then the recontainment, right? So they are able to see exactly what happened. And I feel like that connection that is built over time would help them understand a lot of things and unlearn a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
So thank
Absolutely.
you so much for this, for this talk. I think it was very informative, and I think it really helps people see that they can give permission to themselves, and they have so much agency to sort of transform their experiences of shame, into
Yeah.
self-compassion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you very much for inviting me.
wish you great success in your doctoral research. And I hope
Thank you.
we all get to see, we all get the manuals, we all get to practice it in our sessions as well. So thank you so much for
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Have a wonderful day.